What's up, everybody? I have a very special surprise for you today. A little bit of a gift, I guess you could say, for all of the hard work that you've put in this video series. I am going to give you my editor. If you remember back to the very first video in this series, I was showing my game The Path of Motus, and we had that little editor window to the right where you could draw walls and drag and drop images and game objects. Well, I'm going to give you that editor today, and we will plug it into our game engine, and this will basically be our last video. This is the last big feature we need to put into our engine. We need the ability to actually edit our level in our game without, exiting the program every time we want to make a change in code. We want to have a more visual way of how we can edit our level. So before we do that, there are a few other things we need to do, a few little functions here and there to make the editor work. The first one we need to write is actually in the map class, so let's head there. And when we implement this form, the editor is it was made on a Windows form. When we bring that form in, it will need the ability to determine where the mouse currently is, and if we click the mouse, it needs to add a wall onto whatever grid we have clicked. So we can separate our entire game world into grids. So already in the map here we have a tile size of 128, so each grid in our level will be 128 by 128. And whatever grid we click on with the mouse, we can place a wall there. But to determine what grid we have pressed, we'll need a little helper function here in the map. And basically it will just take in the position of where the mouse has clicked, and then it will calculate that position and find the exact grid coordinate of where we clicked. So let's make a public point function called getTileIndex. And a point is basically just like a vector2, but instead of being two floats, it is two ints. Okay? So usually I like to use points when we're trying to use coordinates. So that's what we're doing here. We're finding a coordinate. Which grid did we hit? Did we hit grid 2, 1, 2 over on the X, 1 down on the Y? So we'll use a point for that. But we will take in a vector2 called input position, because wherever we click in the game world, that will be in the float format. If for whatever reason input position is equal to new vector2 -1 -1, that will mean that we have not clicked in a valid place on the window. So the Windows form will talk to our map class here, and if the Windows form says that the position we clicked on isn't valid, we'll just immediately return from the function. So let's also return a point that has -1 -1. Usually that means error or not valid whenever you use negative numbers like that. And then finally we'll say return new point int, because we need to convert float to int, input position.x divided by tile size, and then int input position.y divided by tile size. So if this isn't making sense, let's say that we clicked in the game world position of let's say 263, and 263 divided by 128 would give us 2.05468. But remember, whenever we convert to an int doesn't have decimal numbers, so the int would just cut all that off and return 2. So we would be clicking on the second grid on the x-axis. And then same for the y. If the y was also something like 260 divided by 128, it would be 2, 2. So we would return the tile index or the tile coordinate as being 2 on the x, 2 on the y. Alright, And then the Windows form, the stuff that I've coded in the Windows form, it will take care of everything else once it calls this function. Next, we need the ability to restart our level. So it's possible that we are laying some stuff out in our level from the Windows form, and the game objects start moving around and people start firing bullets and all that, but then we want to restart the level and take everything to their default starting positions. So how would we do that? Well, it's actually impossible right now because we don't store the initial position that our game objects are starting at. So what we need to do is implement another vector2 called initial starting position or something like that, and whenever we first initialize our object, we will store the starting position in that vector, and then whenever the Windows form or the editor wants to restart our level, we can just reset all our positions to be the initial starting position. So let's head over here to gameObject.cs, and underneath this batch of variables here, I'll make a new vector2 that is public, and I will call it start position. We'll start it off being -1, -1. That way we know it's not a valid starting position. And then down here in the initialize, let's say if start position equals new vector2 -1, -1, that means we have not set our start position variable yet. So let's set start position to our current position, and that will store that. Finally, we need to make a function called public virtual void set to default position. And the editor will call this function whenever we restart the level, and this function will basically do one thing, very simple: position equals start position. And that's it. So if you remember back in the last video, we set up a class called animation data, and that class was used to save out and load XML files that contain data for our animations. I'd also like to set up a class that takes care of the things we want to store while we are saving out and loading XML files that represent our level. So the level editor that I am providing, it already takes care of saving out and loading the XML level files, but we need to create a class called level data that stores all the information we want that XML file to contain. So let's right-click Game Engine and go to Add Class. I'm going to name this class Level Data, capital L, capital D. Let's go to the GameObject.cs and copy over the using statements. And since this file will also be working with XML related things, let's also say using system.xml.serialization. Let's make the class public. And then inside of the class, we just need to define what data we want to save out. So let's think about what are the essential things in our game. We have the game objects list. I'd say that's pretty important to save out. We also have the decorations list that contains all the images to pretty up our level. We have a list of walls inside of our map class. That's pretty essential. And I'd also say it's important to save out how wide and how tall our current level is. Remember, later when we implement the editor, we can define the grid, and the grid will tell us how wide and how tall we are making this level. So that's probably some good information to save out too. So let's just say in the class, public list of game object, objects. And remember, because XML is looking at this to decide what data needs to be saved and loaded, it's looking for properties, so it's looking for these get and set keywords here. Let's put those. Below here, I'll say public list walls. Same thing, we'll say get set. public list decor, called decor, get set, and then finally the two ints, so public int map width, get set, and public int map height, get set. Now whenever we are saving out a list of a class that has deriving members, XML will get confused. So in our game object list, we have a player, we have enemies. Those are game objects, so that is valid, but XML doesn't know the difference between a game object and a player, and the difference between a game object and an enemy. So we need to use what's called an XML element, and this is basically a tag that we put on top of variables that we're saving out, and it will clarify to XML the classes that will appear in here, the deriving child classes, okay? So let's do a little bracket like that. XML element, player, make sure you spell that exactly like you have defined your player class, and then comma, type equals type of player. Okay? And that basically says, hey XML, when you see a class that's called player with a capital P, it's a type of player class. I know this seems kind of stupid, but if you don't do this and you save out a level, your engine will crash because XML will be confused and it won't understand the differences of these classes, okay? Let's also paste another one here, and we'll say enemy, and that should be it for this class. We should be ready to go. Now earlier in the first or second video, we added a utility class here called XML helper. Let's go to that. If you remember, we basically commented out the entire class because we needed this level data class to be written. So let's highlight all of this and then go up here to the uncomment selected lines button, press that, and now we have an XML helper class that will load and save the level data class we just defined. So whenever we call XML helper.load or XML helper.save, we can save out all of the data that's in our game and load it back in later when the game restarts. The Windows form that we'll add in later already calls these functions. I can show you that later, but for now, you'll probably never have to look at this class again, so I'll exit out. We're almost ready to bring in the form for the editor, but we need to include some references to make it work. If you remember back in my Intro to Programming series, we worked on Windows Forms a little bit. We made a calculator and a memory game. Well, to have access to Windows Forms, you need to include a reference to it. We also need to include references to a few other system libraries to make the Windows Form stuff work correctly. So I'm going to right-click References and hit Add Reference. Under Framework, see here there's Assemblies, and then click Framework. Let's go down to system.windows.forms. And then we also need system, just system, plain, like that. And then we need the system.data and system.drawing, which is right here. So after you have all of those check marked, hit OK. It will add all of those references for us. And now the moment you've all been waiting for, it's time to bring in the editor. Let's go to the Michael Hicks toolbox, and inside the code folder, there is a folder called Editor. Let's open that up, and let's select all three files, and then drag them in to our game engine project. We should be able to double click, and here it is. You should see this entire form with stuff already on top of it. You see the buttons, the list box, all that stuff should be there, but you should now have a ton of errors. Okay, we will fix them. Let's start with the obvious thing to do, and that is to change the namespace. So let's right-click the editor.cs file and go to View Code. At the top here, for the namespace, let's change FNA class code to be Game Engine, or whatever you named your project. Mine is Game Engine, so we need to make sure it's included with the rest of our code. Let's also right-click the if you don't see this file, make sure you click this arrow on the editor.cs, and then here is a .designer.cs file. Let's right-click that and then go to View Code. Same thing at the very top. Let's change the namespace from FNA class code to Game Engine, capital G, capital E. For me, all of my errors have went away, but that is because I have spelled everything in our other classes exactly like how they are spelled in the editor.cs class. So if you named your variables differently than I have any time throughout this series, it is quite possible that it's throwing errors because it can't find the variable name. Now, very quickly, let me just explain what this is doing. All this thing is doing is basically talking with the lists inside of our game engine. So whenever we add a new object, it's adding an object to our game objects list inside of game1.cs. Whenever we are adding a new wall or editing a wall to be wider or whatever, it's just changing variables back in our game engine classes, okay? So any of the lists in game1.cs or the wall list in map.cs, the decoration list in map.cs, all it's doing basically is interfacing to those variables. So any remaining errors that you have are most definitely naming related, okay? Now there's a simple way we can fix that. You could, if you'd like, you could go through this editor.cs file, and for every single red line that you get, you could just fix the naming to be like how you've done it, or you could rename the variable. So let's say we want to rename our wall list right here. There's a way that you can just rename this variable here one time and then have Visual Studio update the name of it everywhere else. So let's say I want to change the name of walls to be wall list. I can just change that, and then notice that whenever I highlight or hover over this in Visual Studio, there's this little light bulb. I can click the light bulb, and it gives me the option to rename walls to wall list. I could click that, and then Visual Studio would automatically rename that variable everywhere in the code base. So if, let's say you're wanting to rename it like I have, you would just say, you know, backspace, do whatever you need to do, name it to walls, and then hit that light bulb option and say rename to walls, and that should fix the errors for that variable, okay? I promise, you might have like 100 errors. I promise this isn't bad. It should fit right in. They should all be naming errors. So once you fix that, like I said, mine's good to go. Let's try to build the project and make sure it's still running. I'm going to hit F5. Okay, game's still running like normal. Let's exit out. So we have no errors. I have this new Windows form in the project successfully. Now we need to create a new instance of this Windows form so we can actually start the editor whenever we are trying to launch our game. Let's go back to game1.cs. And at the very top here, underneath the game HUD, I'm going to create a new instance of the editor, like this. Well, actually, let's just define it first. Because, think about this for a second. What if we are wanting to build the game and then distribute it to our friends? We don't want our friends to see that editor, right? That's not professional. Only we want to see the editor if we are working on the game. So let's just set it up where the only time that the editor actually starts is when the program is running in debug mode. Remember, up here at the top, you can start your program in debug or release, and then in the bin folder, wherever you save your project, there's a debug and release folder. If you wanted to distribute the final version of your game without the editor starting, you could run it in release mode. Otherwise, if you're just wanting to start the game to work on your levels, you could start it in debug, and in debug mode, the editor will start. So down here at the top of initialize, I'm going to use a hashtag like this, or a number sign, pound sign. Hashtag, I'm thinking Twitter. You know what I mean. Pound sign, if debug, and then pound sign end if. And I believe these are called preprocessor constants or something like that. I can't remember the exact terminology. Sorry, bad programmer here. But basically, these run right before the code compiles. And if the condition is true, Visual Studio will include this code as it compiles. Otherwise, if it's not true, it will ignore the code and leave it out. So if we are in debug mode, so if debug is true, we will say editor equals new editor, and then we will call editor.show. So this will bring up that Windows form to let us add things to our level. We also need to pass in to the constructor here a game1 input game. We are currently in game 1, so we can just pass in this. The way that I've set up the form is basically it saves an instance of game1.cs, and then whenever you start going through in the Windows form and changing the sizes of the walls or adding a new game object, it just goes into the game1 code here and starts adding things or editing things in our lists. So basically the Windows form is just talking back and forth with our code here, alright? So that's why we have to pass this in. Let's copy this if chunk here, and then down in the load content, right after sprite batch, let's paste, and then say editor dot load textures, and that will load in whatever we need for the Windows form. It's also asking for a content manager, so let's pass in content, capital C. Next, let's copy the if chunk, and then down in the update function, we need to update the Windows form, so let's call update. It's asking for our list of objects and our map, so let's pass that in. And then finally, inside of our sprite batch.begin, right here, we'll paste this and call draw. Let's pass in sprite batch, and I believe we are good to go. Let's press F5 and see what happens. Alright, so on the right side of our window we have a Windows form. Let's see if it plugged in okay. This is my first time testing this too, so I'm going to be very happy if this just works. And it does. Check that out. So here in the wall list, I switched over to the wall mode. See, here are our walls that we've defined. Let's go down here in the bottom right and click draw grid, and check that out. There's our grid. Each grid is 128 by 128. Let's click this grid right here and see if a wall is drawn. It is, so we've just added a new wall. We can extend it by just clicking to the next grid over. If we want to remove that wall, we can right click it, so anything we right click there will be removed. Let's go to the objects list over here. In our objects list we have a player and we have an enemy. And notice that when you click player and enemy, you see the X and Y positions change here in this box. So we can change the starting position of where the player and enemy start. Let's move the player over 1. So I'll hit up, and then now he should start 1 grid over whenever we hit reset. Remember, reset will restart our level, so let's click that. Yep, and he did. See, he moved over. We also have this highlight selected option, and notice that whenever that's clicked, a little box comes over whatever we are currently looking at. So see, the shy boy has that box. We can also hold down the left control and then click whatever we want to highlight. So if you have a big list of game objects and you don't want to go through the list and find exactly which enemy you're looking for, you can hold down the left control and then click the object you want to immediately go to. So see, I'm clicking between the enemy and the player. So that's a nice little shortcut there. Next, let's go to the decoration. And in that list, we have only one decoration called background. That is also correct. Notice that it's also drawing the highlighted box. I'll turn that off for now. There's a few things that we have here to change. First, you'll notice that we have a source rectangle option. And this is useful if you're bringing in environment art that has a bunch of different buildings on one image. So say you brought in a sprite sheet that has 3 buildings and you only want to draw the one on the far left. We could decrease the width to be 600. And look, now only that first half of the image is drawing. So you can use this to define what part or what chunk of the image you want to draw. You also have the layer depth option here. Remember, the layer depth is the order we want to draw in. So if we brought in another image that we want to draw in front of the background, we would set the layer depth to be 0.8 or 0.9, something in front of it. Remember, 1 is farthest back. You can already see if you take the layer depth to be 0, the background now draws in front of every other thing in the game window here. So I'll take that back to 1. You can also very quickly copy decorations from the list by holding left control and then hitting C. Make sure that the game window is currently in view, but notice as soon as I hit Control C, we have a copy of the decoration that was currently selected. So later on, when you're designing your levels and you're wanting to, let's say, tile an image 2 or 3 times, you don't have to re-add the image every single time. You can just say Control C. I'm going to go ahead and remove those copies by hitting remove. We can also add in any type of decoration we want. So I'm going to say add, and look, it brought in a placeholder image here. You should see this little white box with decor on it. That is actually an image that we placed in our content folder, I believe in the last video. It's just a placeholder image, so I'm going to click where I want this to be. Notice that it's locking to the grid. So if we had the grid drawing, you could see, but see it locks to whatever grid space I'm on. I'm going to go ahead and place this decoration right here, so I will click it. And notice that after I click it once, it stays right there. So it's a little drag and drop system there. But let's go ahead and change the image. I'm going to hit load right here next to the image. Alright, well, looks like we just crashed. Let's see what's going on here. That was such a good moment there, and it had to be ruined by a crash. Alright, let's see. Show us something good, Visual Studio. Come on, speed up. Alright, it says, exception unhandled. System.threading, thread state exception. Current thread must be set to single thread apartment, STA mode, before OLE calls can be made. So I'm not really sure what that means. How about we Google this and see if we can find a solution. And I'm going to let you all do that really fast. See if you can find the solution. And resume the video once you found that solution or once you're stumped. Alright? Okay, so I'm going to assume you're back now. I know what the solution is because I've already Googled this. And the solution that I found online, I'm going to go ahead and stop, is that in our program.cs class over here, this is where the initial thread is starting our game. And we need to put a tag right above this function to let Visual Studio know that this is a STA thread. Alright? So I pressed enter, I'm going to backspace those backslashes there, and then all we have to say is STA thread, just like that, and that should fix the crash. Let's press F5. Okay. Now I'm going to go back to the decoration list. I'll turn off the highlight selected, and let's try to load again. Alright, So now a window has been brought up, so everything's working now. You can find anywhere on your computer a image that you want to load in. The warning though is that if you start saving out levels, bringing in the images that you've located on your hard drive, you have to make sure that those images are in your content folder. Okay? That has to happen, otherwise your game will crash and it won't find the images. But for now, when you're in editor mode initially, you can locate any image on your computer and load it in to your level. But whenever you save out that file and load in the file later, the images that you picked earlier must be in the Visual Studio content folder. And the option and properties for copying to the output directory, that must be copy if newer. We've done all of that stuff before. I just want to throw that out there in case you start experimenting, okay? Let's find an image. I have a little avatar here from the path of Motus. I'm going to bring that in. And, oh, oops. I just replaced the background. I replaced the background with that avatar. My bad. All right, but that's cool, though. See? And then I can hit Control-C. And then see right here, it crashed. Whenever I tried to copy this, it's saying it could not load the asset Michael Hicks Motus avatar, and it could not be found because it's looking inside of the content folder here, okay? So I'm glad I did that to make my point. That's the one little warning sign here, and I made it, I wanted it to be like this on purpose, okay? I could have saved the image path and made this not happen, but I wanted it to have a hard crash, so you're for sure putting those images in your folder, because later when you distribute your game, the players that you send your game to, they have to have these images. So, yeah. I'm going to hit stop. If you'd like to see how the Windows form has been programmed, you can right-click the editor.cs and go to View Code. At the very top here, we have an object type. And this is an enumeration that I've created that lets you create new game objects. And we will mess with this a little more in the next video. I'll give a demonstration on how you can create new game objects and then implement them into the editor. But basically, you'll do it by adding the name of the object you want here. Okay? You will also need to make sure that this object's namespace thing right here, it needs to be the same namespace as everything else in your game engine. So, for me, that it would crash. If we tried to make a new game object, it would crash. This string right here, it says FNA class code dot. Alright? We need to make sure it says game engine dot. This needs to be set to whatever namespace has all of your objects for your game. So, enemy is inside of the namespace game engine, player is inside of the namespace game engine. Alright? So, this should fix that. And the only other thing you'll have to do whenever you want to add in a new object in the editor is just add them here in this enumeration. So let's press F5 and I'll show that real fast. So if I go over here to the objects list, see down here there's an enemy. This list right here will have all of the game objects you can add. Right now it's only enemy, and this is being populated from the enumeration I was showing you in the code. So I will hit add, and look, I've added a new enemy. I will let him go right there. He's being randomized on the x-axis, but we can add a whole bunch of enemies now, and they will all randomize whenever we shoot them. So let's try shooting them. Yeah, so that's working, right? Now we have 4 enemies. They're all respawning randomly. All right. Sorry, I got a little carried away there. I was enjoying that. But yeah, that's how you would add new game objects. Let me show you a few more things in the code here. I would encourage you, I mean, I really don't like Windows form design. Like, I hate doing editor stuff, just to be honest. This is a stripped down version of what I'm using for our games, The Path of Motus and Pillar. And you can easily extend this, so if you wanted to add the functionality to, I I don't know, change the color of a decoration, you could go to the toolbox and then bring in the appropriate forms. And then all you'd have to do is double click the whatever you dragged in from the toolbox. So if you double click like the add button, it creates a function for whenever it's clicked or whenever the tool has been edited. And then you would just go in here and say something like game dot map dot decor, and then for the index you could say list box, because that's the list of whatever we're currently looking at. List box dot selected index. If you look back on the design view, this big box right here, that's our list box. So if we are in wall mode, it will have all of the walls from our wall list. If it's in objects mode, it will have all of the game objects from the objects list. Okay, so whatever the list box dot selected index is, that's the current item that we have selected in the list box. That would be the current decoration that we have selected or the current object. And then you would just say draw color equals whatever you want it to be. So here you would take the information from the tools that's on the form and you can set literally whatever you want. Okay, it's just a way of interfacing or setting the data back in our game. So the important thing is we have access to this game variable, and then inside of game you have all the stuff we've programmed in the last videos that you can look at and change. Okay, I think that's going to be it for this video. This is pretty exciting. This is the last big chunk that we needed to implement into our game engine. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to add a new game object. We'll go through the whole process. You can basically start creating whatever type of game you want at this point. So I'll show you the kind of basic routine that you would always do to create a new game object, and then we will save out a level and load it into our game 1 load level function. So the series is almost done. Hopefully you think this is exciting stuff. I'll see you all on the next video.